It's a great pleasure to welcome Richard Grusin as our first evening lecture at our symposium. Richard Grusin is the director of the Center for 21st Century Studies and professor of English at the University of Wisconsin-Milwaukee. And he is, one could say, the expert of mediation, from re to pre to radical mediation. Tonight we will hear counter-mediation. And I'm very much looking forward to hear what the counter-mediation is compared to re, pre, and radical mediation. I only want to mention two books, very new books. The one, Anthropocene Feminism, which came out with Minnesota Press this year. And the next one, After Extinction, will be out next year in January. Did you? Yeah. Okay. Okay. Thank you very much, Richard, for making your way from the U.S. to Potsdam, and the floor is yours.
Thank you. Okay. Is that good? So hopefully this will be about 50 minutes. If I don't stop for too many, digressions. We were talking in the break, and I know that I probably used some version of the word intensity several times in this paper, so I'll be much more self-conscious about that than I might have been. I'll also say that this is a very old-fashioned paper, so a bit about American political theory, so we'll see. Okay. The idea for this paper grows out of a plenary address I delivered in Berlin in February at Transmediale 2017 on Donald Trump's evil mediation. In that talk and a subsequent longer article in Theory and Event, I argued that Trump and his team engaged in a persistent campaign of evil mediation to secure the Republican nomination and the White House, a campaign which continues in the first year of the Trump administration. Building on Matthew Fuller and Andrew Goffey's trenchant analysis of evil media, I deployed the concept of evil mediation to help make sense of the legitimate and illegitimate techniques used by Trump to obtain the presidency of the U.S., a position that many think makes him the most powerful man in the world. I focused on the infrastructural workings of Trump's evil mediation because the pressing challenge to elude and oppose Trump's fascist remediation of the U.S. government demands new ways to think about how we might critique, resist, or ultimately overthrow his illegitimate autocratic rule. During the Q&A after my talk, I invoked the concept of counter-mediation in response to a question that asked what could be done to combat the evil affective media assault engaged in by the Trump campaign. After the talk, Marie-Luise came up to me and asked me if I'd be willing to say more about counter-mediation at this conference, to which I had already accepted an invitation. Perhaps foolishly, I agreed. This talk is a first attempt at thinking through the concept of counter-mediation, not just as a term of opposition or resistance, but as a fundamental component of American democracy. First section. The conference description for affective transformation sets out a double logic of affectivity, which on the one hand is measured, calculated, and controlled by forms of techno-scientific management, and on the other hand is mobilized, fomented, and unleashed by politics and social media. In the 2016 U.S. presidential election, the Trump campaign deployed both logics of affective transformation to unleash and to control the collective affect of the U.S. electorate, in part through a company called Cambridge Analytica, which describes itself as a global election management agency. Working in affective and perhaps also logistical conjunction with the Trump campaign, Russian operatives have been found to have pursued similar affective transformations through bots and human agents by stirring up racist, misogynist, and nationalist feelings among loosely targeted segments of the electorate on Facebook, Twitter, YouTube, and other social media. Questions of evil mediation and fake news may seem common outside of Western democracies. In autocratic regimes like Putin's Russia or the People's Republic of China or now in Myanmar. But when they make their way into ostensibly free and open Western democracies like the US, the EU, and the UK, the global media public begins to sound the alarm, particularly about the corruption or destruction of democratic political debate in the age of social media. Although my theoretical archive and practical examples tonight will be mainly drawn from the US, my arguments should have relevance in other national contexts as well. I look forward to learning from you in the discussion that follows the extent to which similar tactics of mediation and counter-mediation may be at work here in Germany or in the EU more generally. Insofar as these political tactics of affective transformation often operate independent of a problematic of representation with its associated postulates about meaning, truth, falsity, and so on, we will, in the future, I believe, need to heed the advice of Barrett Anderson and Brett Horvath to build better automated engagement systems to counter these weaponized propaganda machines and contest these techniques of evil mediation. But as important as it is to use automated manipulation systems against this affective management, we also need, I want to suggest, other forms of counter-mediation, including denunciations of false messages through both automated and voluntary human means. To argue that we must fight mediation with counter-mediation, however, is not to argue against the continued use of the power of the masses at the ballot box, in marches and protests, nonviolent and violent demonstrations, or riots and strikes, to counter the workings of evil mediation. Such collective actions can operate themselves as forms of counter-mediation through transforming the circulation of affect within formal and informal print, televisual, and socially networked media. Indeed, one of the operating principles of my theory of radical mediation is that online or traditionally technical mediations cannot be disentangled from embodied mediations. It is, as far as I am concerned, mediation all the way down. One consequence of this operating principle is to urge that we avoid narratives that involve positing fundamental breaks or discontinuities between one historical regime and another, including those that attribute agency for such breaks to new forms and practices of media and mediation. Left-wing condemnations of the evil mediation campaigns launched by Trump and his supporters, particularly those that aimed to exacerbate and inflame social, cultural, and political divisions among the U.S. electorate, have too often relied upon hyperbolic rhetorical claims about the unprecedented nature of such techniques to declare the impending end of democracy in the United States, and perhaps soon across the EU. Such hyperbolic claims often work, I would maintain, to aid rather than deter these techniques by obscuring the historical precedents for such affective transformations and by intensifying the partisan divides exploited by Trump's evil mediations. Nor, I am afraid, does the now conventional and almost daily practice in the U.S. press of formal and informal media to painstakingly correct the lies, ignorance, disinformation, and fake news coming out of Trump world, nor do these do much to counter the onslaught of affective transformation. Such corrections, often presented as truthometers, this is by Politico.com, while intellectually satisfying to Trump's educated opponents, do little or nothing to change the dynamic of public discourse or feelings surrounding Trump's presidency. Finally, the widespread practice of mocking Trump and his confederates for their ignorance through memes, tweets, and other forms of satire and ridicule, which all of us probably have participated or enjoyed, may provide us with emotional pleasure, but hardly serve to win over any potential voters or to change anyone's media practices and techniques. In a recent New York Times op-ed, legal scholar Tim Wu has written, "You need not be a media historian to notice that we live in a golden age of press harassment, domestic propaganda, and coercive efforts to control political debate. The Trump White House repeatedly seeks to discredit the press, threatens to strip broadcasters of their licenses, and calls for the firing of journalists and football players for speaking their minds." That's American football players. A foreign government tries to hack our elections, and journalists and public speakers are regularly attacked by vicious online troll armies whose aim is to silence opponents. In the time I have allotted for me today, I want to take up the question of what counter-mediation might look like in relation to these coercive efforts to control political debate. I will begin by considering what Jonathan Flatley describes following Heidegger as affective counter-moods. Flatley's brilliant analysis of the use of a union newspaper and the creation of such counter-moods in a Detroit auto factory strike of 1968 offers some promising avenues to pursue in thinking about counter-mediation. I'll then turn to Walter Lippmann's account of the role of newspapers in the creation of public opinion, both in the early 20th century and in the first and 21st century, both in the early 20th century and in the first century and more of the American Republic. Lippmann's analysis of James Madison's classic 18th century treatment of the dangers of political factions helps me to argue that the problems of collective affective transformation and counter-mediation are not in fact new, but have been built into the system of U.S. Republican government. Finally, I'll return to the ongoing investigation of Russian interference in the U.S. election via social media, arguing that Facebook, Twitter, YouTube, and other social media operate, at least for political purposes, as something like the newspapers of the 21st century. Counter-moods. In How a Revolutionary Counter-Mood is Made, Jonathan Flatley brings together Heidegger, Lenin, and Nancy in order to analyze how in 1968, members of the League of Revolutionary Black Workers in Detroit, in the form of the explicitly Marxist-Leninist Dodge Revolutionary Union Movement, or DRUM, deployed a weekly factory newspaper, also called DRUM, to generate what Flatley calls a revolutionary countermood across a number of factories in the Detroit area. Formed in response to a spontaneous wildcat strike at the Dodge main plant in May 1968, DRUM worked in the next couple of months to organize a planned strike at that same factory 2 months later in July. In addition to revisiting a now almost forgotten episode in labor history, Flatley aims to map out how affective countermoods might ultimately be mobilized in the service of revolutionary communism. My interest in introducing Flatley's essay here is not in revolutionary communism per se, but in how the structure of affective countermoods he lays out might be used as, with, or in the service of something like counter-mediation. Flatley begins his essay with the Heideggerian concept of Stimmung, or mood, which Heidegger characterizes as the medium in which our thinking, doing, and acting occurs. Moods for Heidegger are not psychological states within humans, but environments within which humans live, act, and feel. Inasmuch as mood is a fundamental medium or presupposition through which we apprehend the world, Flatley writes, it also allows certain affects, which are more punctual and more object-oriented than moods, to attach to certain objects, while at the same time foreclosing other attachments. Thus, to shape the mood or Stimmung of a particular historical moment, a particular time or place, is to shape the kinds of affects available to individuals and groups. As Flatley puts it, Only if I'm in a fearful or fearless mood can I encounter something as threatening. Whatever my mood, whether it's irritable, eager, nervous, optimistic, depressed, confident, bored, or militant, some certain persons, objects, and memories will come into my affective view, and others will not. Some people will appear as friends and others as enemies, and some tasks will seem possible and attractive while others will not even enter the field of consideration. Because for Heidegger and Flatley, we are always in some mood or another. We do not move from states of no mood to then being in a mood. We only shift from one mood to another, and indeed Heidegger insists that this is the only way that we can exert agency in relation to our moods. When we master a mood, Heidegger writes, we do so by way of a counter-mood. We are never free of moods. In other words, although Flatley doesn't put it in exactly this way, all moods are counter-moods. Heidegger does not offer much direction on how one might consciously create a new counter-mood. Flatley instead finds Lenin a helpful source in thinking through how something like a revolutionary counter-mood might be created in members of the working class, how they might be moved from thinking about themselves as constituting a class in itself to a class for itself. In particular, he finds Lenin's belief that the party newspaper can help create a revolutionary counter-mood helpful for understanding the case of Drum in 1968. When people read stories in such a paper about the mistreatment of others, Lenin believes, they will feel that they are being oppressed by the same dark forces oppressing the persons they read about. Flatley borrows from Nancy's ideas in Being Singular Plural to expand upon Lenin's point in terms of countermoods. The worker or peasant who reads about another's mistreatment in the party newspaper and suddenly feels that he shares something with this other person finds her or himself in a new Stimmung, one which has disclosed a different there and a different way of being many together, making friends and enemies visible in a way that they were not previously. Things matter in a new way, a way that is manifestly and consciously plural. A new we has come into being, one that enables in its turn a different I to be experienced and articulated. Actions which previously did not even enter the mind, targets which were previously invisible, now seem not only newly possible, but nearly compulsory, objects of a desire now irresistible. Drum leadership, who were themselves avid readers of Lenin, shared the view that a newspaper could be a valuable means of shaping a counter-mood among Dodge main factory workers through what psychologist Donald Stern has described as affective attunement. Flatley describes how Drum leadership wrote stories about worker mistreatment to foster a feeling or mood among other workers that you could be next. In such a mood, he writes, instead of feeling isolated or alienated by one's racist treatment by the foreman, depressed about the injuries one has suffered and seen and the inadequate treatment received by the doctors, exhausted by the back-breaking speed of work on the assembly line, and anxious about the dangers there, one feels that these feelings are shared with others, and moreover that there is strength in that sharing, that the others with whom one shares that experience exceed the number and force of the oppressors. Further intensifying the experience of reading at this moment is the feeling of sharing an affective experience not only with the person being described, but also with all the other people reading. What is perhaps most germane in Flatley's account for thinking about counter-mediation in the current mood of the U.S. media public is the role of the Drum newspaper in helping to create a counter-mood, particularly through its mode of circulation. Flatley notes the significance of the fact that the authors of the paper were also workers, and that the issues of Drum, the mimeographed, folded over pieces of 8.5 by 14-inch paper, were passed from hand to hand, from worker to worker. The materiality of the paper and its embodied distribution from one worker to another underscores the fact that counter-mediations, like counter-moods, must not only involve immaterial narrative or other representational accounts, but must also entail a translation or transformation from one form of mediation to another. As Flatley writes, a mode of circulation is established that works against a feeling of isolation and establishes a way of being with that contrasts to the institutional logic of the plant and the union. Representing the experience of work is no longer something that is done for or to one, but with one. The work of representation and the representation of work are now held in common. Communication and sharing within this logic require and produce a multiplicity of distinct but connected positions in a common affective space. I've rehearsed Flatley's argument in such detail because it provides an interesting model for thinking about how one might want to conceptualize counter-mediation at the current historical moment and with our current forms and practices of print, televisual, and networked mediation. While Trump's evil mediation has sometimes deployed print newspapers, the function of the newspaper in today's so-called media ecology is a very different one from the first decades of the 20th century or the 1960s. Nonetheless, I'm convinced that the formation of affective countermoods must rely on the kind of embodied materiality of our contemporary media every day, just as it has in the past. For while it's true that we get our news today primarily from online media sources, our media have what I have elsewhere called an affective life. Our engagement with social media, for example, is no less material and embodied than engagement with newspapers was in early 20th century Russia or in the US in the 1960s. It's true that this material embodiment is different now than it once was, but it's not less material or less embodied than in the past. In many ways, in fact, it's more so as we interact haptically with our keyboards and touchscreens and speak directly to our devices. But before returning to the idea that social media like Facebook have become something like the newspapers of the 21st century, I want to turn to American journalist and political theorist Walter Lippmann, whose classic book, Public Opinion, takes up the significant role played by the press in forming public opinion in a democracy. In American social and political theory, Walter Lippmann is best remembered for his debate with John Dewey in the 1920s about material democracy and the role of citizens in making up democratic publics. Although the debate had many facets, one of the key issues of contention involved Lippmann's conviction that the public was unable to keep up with the complexity of world affairs in the early 20th century without the aid of journalists to translate or mediate this knowledge for them. Dewey, on the other hand, believed that the public could understand these issues on their own through open democratic debate in a kind of pre-Habermasian public forum or public sphere. Lippmann has often been criticized for elitism in his belief that the public needed to rely on experts to filter knowledge of complex social and political issues for them. But what I find most interesting about his work is its function as a kind of precursor to late 20th and 21st century media theory in its recognition of the challenges posed to democracy by an increasingly technologically mediated society. Lippmann's foundational premise was that democratic citizens could only understand the overwhelming multiplicity of the important events of modernity through the mediation of journalism. Just as McLuhan, some 40 years later, would refer to media as constituting our environment, Lippmann believed that we could only understand the world outside through the pictures in our heads created by the fictions which make up what he called the pseudo-environment that operates between humans and the world. By fictions, he didn't mean falsehoods, but rather the man-made social and cultural beliefs, practices, and habits of mind and action through which people make sense of the world. Lippmann's ideas seem even more pertinent at the beginning of the 21st century, where we interact with the cultural, social, political, and ecological issues of the day through the technical mediation of print, televisual, and networked media. Even if such technologies as interactive media and live video make it seem as if we have a more direct and unmediated access to many world affairs than was available in Lippmann's day. Lippmann's fullest early treatment of these ideas comes in his 1922 book, Public Opinion, where he lays out in great detail his account of the role of the press in informing and sometimes misleading the citizens of technological societies. I want to focus here on his discussion of newspaper reading as a way both to develop further how media like the newspaper function as affective counter-mediations and to draw out some of the parallels with and differences from the functioning of social media today. Lippmann is among the first American writers to emphasize the crucial role of news reporting in political thought, by emphasizing that the citizens of a republic depend upon the news for their knowledge of the world. The problem this poses, however, is twofold. On the one hand, such knowledge must necessarily be incomplete. He writes, all the reporters in the world working all the hours of the day could not witness all the happenings in the world. Newspapers, Lippmann notes, do not try to keep an eye on all mankind. Before a series of events become news, they have usually to make themselves noticeable in some more or less overt act. Not only does Lippmann see the news media as providing a limited selection of what's happening across the world, but as he writes in The Phantom Public in 1930, the proliferation of newspapers in the 20s makes it impossible for anyone to keep up with the news that's been selected for them, even if they wanted to. For the man does not live who can read all the reports that drift across his doorstep or all the dispatches in his newspaper. And if by some development of the radio, every man could see and hear all that was happening everywhere, if publicity, in other words, became absolute, how much time could or would he spend watching the Sinking Fund Commission and the Geological Survey? He would probably tune in on the Prince of Wales, or in desperation throw off the switch and seek peace in ignorance. It's bad enough today with morning newspapers published in the evening and evening newspapers in the morning, with October magazines in September, with the movies and the radio, to be condemned to live under a barrage of eclectic information, to have one's mind made the receptacle for a hullabaloo of speeches, arguments, and unrelated episodes. Thus, for Lippmann, newspapers present both too little information and too much. They only provide a small selection of the world's news, but do so in an overwhelming variety of mediated forms. We can see these same two problems in today's hyper-mediated social news networks, which are much more numerous and overwhelming than the environment Lippmann described, and which deploy a multitude of new technologies that claim to be more immediate and participatory than print, if not quite as totalizing as Lippmann's hypothetical imagination of a universal radio. The formation of filter bubbles and the operations of newsfeed algorithms like Facebook's EdgeRank pose the same problems of partiality and selectivity for us that Lippmann described nearly a century ago. Every newspaper he writes when it reaches the reader is the result of a whole series of selections as to what items shall be printed, in what position they shall be printed, how much space each shall occupy, what emphasis each shall have. There are no objective standards here. There are conventions. The journalistic conventions of the 20th century have been automated as the newsfeed algorithms of the 21st. Through a process of self-selection intensified by the algorithms of social media, we live today in a pseudo-environment different only in degree from that of the citizens of Lippmann's day. As the election and presidency of Donald Trump have dramatized, an important problem posed by these media pseudo-environments is how to persuade or mobilize people to change their minds, or in Flatley's powerful term, their moods. Our media pseudo-environments, I would argue, constitute precisely the moods or Stimmung within which we live, think, feel, and act. To return to the question of affectivity that motivates this conference, how can one create counter-mediations to alter moods that are simultaneously measured, calculated, and controlled, and on the other hand, mobilized, fomented, and unleashed by forms of technoscientific management, politics, and social media? For Lippmann, this problem takes shape in terms of what he calls the enlisting of interest. Interest is, for Sylvan Tompkins, the most basic affective state, the one that's a necessary but not sufficient prerequisite for all human affect. Tompkins says that without being interested in something, we can't feel something about it, and that interest is a kind of trigger affect that other affects then attach themselves to. Although Lippmann wrote well before Tompkins, he shares with Tompkins a reliance on the psychology of William James, for whom emotional states were irreducibly physical. Lippmann sees human self-interest as inextricable from emotion, especially in regard to things like the news. What reaches him of public affairs, a few lines of print, some photographs, anecdotes, and some casual experience of his own, he conceives through his set patterns and recreates with his own emotions. He does not take his personal problems as partial samples of the greater environment. He takes his stories of the greater environment as a mimic enlargement of his private life. This sounds a lot like a recipe for Facebook, with its algorithmic mingling of personal preferences and dislikes with stories of the world at large. But as Lippmann elaborates, and as social media in general bears out, there is no oneself always at work, and therefore it's of great importance in the formation of any public opinion what self is engaged. We understand that we see the same body, but often a different man, depending on whether he's dealing with a social equal, a social inferior, or a social superior, on whether he's making love to a woman he's eligible to marry or to one whom he is not, on whether he's courting a woman or whether he considers himself her proprietor, on whether he's dealing with his children, his partners, his most trusted subordinates, the boss who can make him or break him, on whether he is struggling for the necessities of life or successful, on whether he's dealing with a friendly alien or a despised one, on whether he is in great danger or in perfect security, on whether he is alone in Paris or among his family in Peoria. Leaving aside the obvious cultural prejudices entailed in some of Lippmann's examples, the point he's making is clear. The fact that people possess multiple selves makes the problem of enlisting interest or provoking a counter-mood complex and multivariate. Public opinion, like individual self-interest, is rarely homogeneous or easily manipulated. And the idea of multiple selves is also one that William James sets out in his chapter on the self in Principles of Psychology, and one of the places that Lippmann gets it from. Interests and factions. Another of Lippmann's reasons for underscoring the multiplicity of individual selves was to underscore the multiplicity of their interests. Contra what he calls the false determinism of both Marxian socialist and capitalist hedonists, what we today would call classical economists, Lippmann argues that self-interest does not follow directly from one's economic interests. He enlists James Madison's Federalist Paper number 10, which takes up the problem of factions formed by class interests in a democratic republic, to refute the idea that one's interests follow directly from one's economic situation, i.e. the interests of one's class. Madison understood factions as directly related to the unequal distribution of wealth and property in society. As a man of property himself, he worried that in a system of majority rule, which the representative democracy set forth in the U.S. Constitution clearly did not establish, a majority class of unpropertied citizens might rise up in revolt to take control of the government through what Madison understood as the tyranny of the majority. Lippmann quotes Madison as saying that a landed interest, a manufacturing interest, a mercantile interest, a moneyed interest, with many lesser interests, grow up of necessity in civilized nations and divide them into different classes, actuated by different sentiments and views. Furthermore, Madison writes, the most common and durable source of factions has been the various and unequal distribution of property. But Lippmann argues that while Madison says that men are divided by their relation to property, he doesn't say that these divisions create specific political interests that directly follow from their property interests. Because Lippmann's convinced that all men have multiple selves, in trying to explain a certain public opinion, it's rarely obvious which of a man's many social relations is affecting a particular opinion. Thus, in trying to invoke a counter-mood, or to implement counter-mediation, it's difficult to know which emotions and which interests one might best invoke. I invoke Lippmann's reading of Madison here because his argument about factions in Federalist 10 speaks familiarly to the question of affective transformations in our current political situation. Madison defines a faction as a number of citizens, whether amounting to a majority or a minority of the whole, who are united and actuated by some common impulse of passion or of interest adverse to the rights of other citizens or to the permanent and aggregate interests of the community. Despite his fear of the power of factions, Madison opposes the idea that the liberty that allows for the formation of factions should be destroyed, arguing instead for a form of constitutional government that can safely regulate factions. The latent causes of faction, he argues, are thus sown in the nature of man, and we see them everywhere brought into different degrees of activity according to the different circumstances of civil society. A zeal for different opinions concerning religion, concerning government, and many other points, as well as of speculation, as of practice. An attachment to different leaders ambitiously contending for preeminence and power, or to persons of other descriptions whose fortunes have been interesting to the human passions, have in turn divided mankind into parties, inflamed them with mutual animosity, and rendered them much more disposed to vex and oppress each other than to cooperate for their common good. So strong is this propensity of mankind to fall into mutual animosities that where no substantial occasion presents itself, the most frivolous and fanciful distinctions have been sufficient to kindle their unfriendly passions and excise their most violent conflicts. Following philosophers like Hume and Montesquieu, Madison understands human interests as the product of passions, what Lippmann would call emotions, and what today we've come to call affects. The solution to regulating, and that passage is just remarkable because it sounds so much like the situation we see today, certainly in the US, but I really think across the West. The solution to regulating factions that was established in the US Constitution and which Madison defended was the creation of a bicameral legislative chamber, one whose membership is based on population, that would be the House of Representatives, and the other on an equal distribution of members across urban and agrarian states, and that would be the Senate. As many political theorists have noted, this structure guaranteed that the gentlemen senators from less populated southern slave states would have a proportionately greater representative power than those from the more populous northern states. This imbalance has carried over into the composition of the Electoral College, which took the election of the American president out of the hands of the majority and allowed a president to lose the popular vote but win the White House, as happened with George W. Bush in 2000 and even more severely with Donald Trump last year. Madison did not explicitly address this possibility in Federalist 10, but he did acknowledge in language that one can't help but hear in relation to Trump that, quote, men of factious tempers, of local prejudices, or of sinister designs may, by intrigue, by corruption, or by other means, first obtain the suffrages and then betray the interests of the people. Nonetheless, Madison was convinced that a republic rather than a democracy was more suited to prevent these possibilities, particularly in a nation as large as the U.S. was then and would prove to be. The nation's concern with factions did not end with the ratification of the Constitution in 1788. 8 years later, America's first president, George Washington, returned to the specter of factions in his farewell address. Like Madison, Washington warned explicitly against factions who would seek to put in the place of the delegated will of the nation the will of a party, often a small but artful and enterprising minority of the community, and according to the alternate triumphs of different parties, to make the public administration the mirror of the ill-concerted and incongruous projects of faction, rather than the organ of consistent and wholesome plans digested by common councils and modified by mutual interests. Even more than Madison's concerns in Federalist 10, this passage can clearly be read as a precursor to the current political situation in the U.S., where the will of a party, a small but artful and enterprising minority of the community, can assume the reins of the government. Nonetheless, like Madison, who drafted much of Washington's farewell address, Washington insists on the power of liberty in the American Republic established by the Constitution to check these potent engines by which cunning, ambitious, and unprincipled men will be enabled to subvert the power of the people and to usurp for themselves the reins of government, destroying afterwards the very engines which have lifted them to unjust dominion. It's interesting then that in light of the present situation in the U.S. regarding Russian attempts to influence the 2016 presidential election, Washington also argues against the influence of foreign nations and the passionate attachment of one nation for another that produces a variety of evils. Sympathy for the favorite nation, facilitating the illusion of an imaginary common interest in cases where no real common interest exists, and infusing into one the enmities of the other, betrays the former into a participation in the quarrels and wars of the latter without adequate inducement or justification. It leads also to concessions to the favorite nation of privileges denied to others, which is apt doubly to injure the nation making the concessions. By unnecessarily parting with what ought to have been retained, and by exciting jealousy, ill will, and a disposition to retaliate in the parties from whom equal privileges are withheld. Washington then goes on to say, as avenues to foreign influence in innumerable ways, such attachments are particularly alarming to the truly enlightened and independent patriot. How many opportunities do they afford to tamper with domestic factions, to practice the arts of seduction, to mislead public opinion, to influence or awe the public councils? Such an attachment of a small or weak towards a great and powerful nation dooms the former to be the satellite of the latter. I've taken this rather long detour into late 18th century American political theory in order to suggest that the crisis of democracy that many commentators see as having emerged from the election and presidency of Donald Trump is in many respects a crisis that's built into the U.S. Constitution and the structure of American democracy, such as it is. That Madison and Washington seem almost to have anticipated the emergence of a faction like Trumpism should caution us about hyperbolic claims that the end of the world or the United States of America is at hand. As Madison and Washington have argued, counter-mediation is built into the structure of American democracy. Whether such counter-mediation is always effective can clearly be debated. But the inflammation of passions and the division of citizens into warring factions is a long-standing problem which the Constitution of the American public was written to regulate and combat. And final section, Facebook, factions, and counter-mediation. At the end of public opinion, Lippmann too makes an argument against hyperbole regarding the horrors of the First World War. Defending the appeal to reason as his concluding attempt at counter-mediation to the situation he sees in the 20s, Lippmann writes, We can do this all the better if we do not allow frightfulness and fanaticism to impress us so deeply that we throw up our hands peevishly and lose interest in the longer run of time because we've lost faith in the future of man. There's no ground for this despair because all the ifs on which, as James said, our destiny hangs are as pregnant as they ever were. What we've seen of brutality, we've seen, and because it was strange, it was not conclusive. It was only Berlin, Moscow, Versailles in 1914 to 1919, not Armageddon, as we rhetorically said. The more realistically men have faced out the brutality and the hysteria, the more they've earned the right to say that it's not foolish for men to believe, because another great war took place, that intelligence, courage, and effort cannot ever contrive a good life for all men. So where does this leave us with counter-mediation today? Don't the algorithmic techniques of social media, with their ability to tailor what we read, see, and hear to our individual or collective interests, possess a power of deepening and intensifying factions that was unimaginable when the Constitution was written in a relatively early formation of print journalism, or when Lippmann was thinking through the role of the press in enlisting individual interest and shaping public opinion? Don't our personal, embodied, almost intimate relations with our networked, mobile, and wearable technologies possess an affective power that makes the socially networked factions of the 21st century much more obdurate and resistant to change than the newspapers of a century ago and more? Yes, probably they do. But that provides more reason, not less, to continue to challenge false and misleading forms of mediation, to read past the headlines and clickbait, to understand more fully exactly how our social media work and how great or small the impact of, for example, Russian influence on Twitter, Facebook, and YouTube actually was. In that spirit, I'll close with two final examples. An October 30th article 2 days ago from the New York Times bears the terrifying headline, "Russian influence reached 126 million through Facebook alone." The article's lead cuts right to the frightening numbers. Russian agents intending to sow discord among American citizens disseminated inflammatory posts that reached 126 million users on Facebook, published more than 131,000 messages on Twitter, and uploaded over 1,000 videos on Google's YouTube service, according to copies of prepared remarks from the companies that were obtained by the New York Times. For those readers frightened by Russia's ability to intensify factions in the American citizenry, the article provides plenty of reasons to be afraid. The new information goes far beyond what companies have revealed in the past and underline the breadth of the Kremlin's effort to lever open divisions in the United States using American technology platforms, especially Facebook. The Russia-linked posts were an insidious attempt to drive people apart, Colin Stretch, the general counsel for Facebook, who will appear at the hearing, said in his prepared remarks. He called the posts deeply disturbing and noted they focused on race, religion, gun rights, and gay and transgender issues. Buried in the article's last paragraph on Facebook, however, we learn that despite the apparently large numbers cited above, Facebook cautioned that the Russia-linked posts represented a minuscule amount of content compared with the billions of posts that flow through users' news feeds every day. Between 2015 and 2017, people in the United States saw more than 11 trillion posts from pages on Facebook. How much of an impact, then, did these Russian posts actually have? Neither Facebook nor the New York Times has any real idea. Yesterday, the international business website Business Insider posted a story with the headline, "Twitter will tell Congress that Russia's election meddling was worse than we first thought." Like the New York Times article, Business Insider's lead provides the terrifying numbers. Twitter will tell Congress this week that Russia-linked accounts generated approximately 1.4 million automated election-related tweets, which collectively received approximately 288 million impressions last year from September 1st to November 15th. The article continues, in a portion of the prepared testimony which Business Insider obtained Monday, Twitter's acting general counsel, Sean Edgett, wrote that the company identified 36,746 accounts that generated automated election-related content and had at least one of the characteristics we used to associate an account with Russia. That's far higher than the number of Russia-linked accounts Twitter initially disclosed to the Senate Intelligence Committee in a closed-door interview last month. Twitter representatives reportedly told investigators that it had uncovered only 201 Russia-linked accounts, leading Democratic Senator Mark Warner to tell reporters that the interview was deeply inadequate. Like the Times article on Facebook, the Business Insider on Twitter is designed to frighten its readers about the extent of Russian involvement with inflammatory rhetoric and large numbers. Also, like the Times article, whose rhetorical format it follows almost exactly, Business Insider buries the paragraph about the relative impact of these accounts, and I quote, Twitter emphasized in its prepared remarks that the nearly 37,000 accounts represented 0.01%, 0.012% of the total accounts of Twitter at the time. Counter-mediation is necessary, it seems, on all sides. These two articles from the Times and Business Insider perform the same function of levering open the divisions in the American public and driving people apart that they explicitly and implicitly accuse Russia's internet research agency, Troll Farm, of doing. In the 21st century, print and online newspapers are joined by social media to play the role that print newspapers alone played when Lippmann wrote in the early 20th century or when Madison and Washington wrote at the end of the 18th. Insofar as American constitutional democracy was created to withstand the disruptive power of factions at a relatively early era of print technology, before mass distribution of newspapers even, one wonders whether it will be able to withstand the intensified factions created and magnified by social media in the 21st century. Given the current state of politics in the United States, the prospect looks increasingly grim. Like newspapers from the 18th to the 20th century, Facebook and other social media in the 21st century create the pseudo-environment through which, or often in place of which, we engage with the pressing issues of the world. Or perhaps put differently, widely shared articles like these, as well as the Russian social media behavior they so dramatically and hyperbolically report, only serve to remind us that, in fact, all mediation is counter-mediation, and that such counter-mediation is not only built into the structure of American democracy, but also into the automated algorithms of social media like Facebook and Twitter. Such a reminder should serve to make us wary not only of Russian interference in our electoral process, but of print, televisual, and network social media's role in manipulating public opinion, both online and off. Thank you.
Can you hear? Yeah. Thank you, Richard, for your lecture. I would like to ask if there are questions. Yes. If not, I have one I would like to ask.
You want to go first?
No, go ahead. Go ahead.
Okay, thank you. That was amazing. I wanted to focus on the role collectivity or maybe even community plays in what you presented, because precisely in the beginning, Drum, the newspaper, gave others the feeling that, gave workers the feeling that there are others. So it was not only a change of mood, but a change of mood that came with a movement of collectivity or like collectivization. And I'm wondering whether today's situation is not as easily compared to that situation back then, for that very reason, because Trump's electorate and also like the people who tend to vote for radical right-wing parties in Europe, if the analysis we have so far about them is right, are conceiving of themselves as somehow a community against some others out there. So they have already a very strong sense of community themselves, and a counter-mediation thus would have to attack that form of community rather than building one, as in the case of the Drum newspaper. And I would like to hear how you would sort of sort that role of community into what you presented.
Yeah, thanks. I think, if I understand what you're getting at, is that what seems clear to me and what I find as the lesson from revisiting early American political theory and the concept of factions is that the way counter-mediation is set up, and it's not counter-mediation, it's counter-mood in Flatley's article, which I greatly admire, is in the way in which much, let's say, Marxist thought operates, in which there is a hegemonic collectivity or sort of a hegemony of capital, and then counter-mood or comes in resistance to that hegemony. And I think what we're seeing today, I don't think that structure obtains in the same way, certainly in American political life, that what we're seeing instead is multiple forms of collectivity and multiple forms of community. So like it or not, the community on the left, which is the community I belong to, and which I think is a much more hospitable, forward-looking, positive, one might even say righteous community, is met with similar communities on the right. And we can say, oh, they're not really communities like we are. They don't really have collectivity in the way we do. But I'm not sure that that's the case. They may have different forms of community and collectivity, but what you see is that these are like dueling counter-mediations. And I think in the kind of conventional power structure that one sees in Marxist thought is that you have not dueling counter-mediations, but actually a kind of hegemonic form of mediation that is then resisted or opposed. And don't get me wrong, capital is still powerful, widespread, and almost hegemonic. But these communities, these collectivities today, the anti-Trump collectivity and so forth, are not, none of them are, or only the very extreme left are challenging capitalism. I mean, this is all a distraction that allows, in a certain sense, the sort of unequal distribution of power and property that Madison talks about to become even more unequal while we're, fighting amongst ourselves. So, so I don't know if that, gets to your question, but I do think that, yes, that these forms of counter-mediation do create and invoke forms of community, and there have been, in fact, the resistance we've seen in the U.S., for example, the Women's March on Inauguration Day, the kind of readiness of people to get their bodies out in the streets and protest and so forth, to call their elected officials, even officials who aren't theirs, and so on. There has been, sorry for the word, but an intensification, or maybe you like the word, an intensification of that kind of communal political interest on the left. But there's also a machine that operates on the right as well, and there are people willing to do the same. The unfortunate thing right now is that, and this is where also I find the discussion of factions by Madison really interesting, and by Washington, is that the faction in power is in fact a minority, that there are greater numbers of people in the communities on the left than there are on the right, and Trump's approval ratings have stayed almost exactly in the same place no matter what he does. He has a solid roughly 35% of the American public that support him, but 2/3 of the public doesn't. So that complicates the situation as well.
Hi, thanks, Richard. This is really interesting, but I just wanted to ask specifically on a material, technological level, if you think that basically online media distribution platforms, whether they actually provide the conditions, like the technological conditions for counter-mediation, because I tend to think that the filter bubbles that we're seeing that are technologically mediated are creating moods that are based around advertising potential. And therefore, are technological forms of countering these types of bubbles or moods that are created, is this even going to be possible? Or is this possible on a material level?
Yeah, I mean, that's really one of the big questions. I think, as I said at the beginning, and citing an article about the Cambridge Analytica situation, that, yeah, I do think it's important for tech folks to try to find ways to counter this sort of automatic and algorithmic formation of these factions that we see happening now. I think that we should do what we can. I mean, I use Facebook Purity on my Facebook, which gets rid of some of the ads and things like that. And I think that the more people build in and create software that could allow us in some ways to resist this, these kinds of techniques, I think the better. On the other hand, it's people, at least in the US, and I will say, I mean, I gave a different talk actually about surveillance in Tübingen in the summer. And a lot of what I was describing about the situation in the US, people said in Germany it's not really as much the case. That is, people are more careful about sharing their data and information and about being surveilled. And I think that my sense is no matter how careful you are, there's lots of data points being gathered about all of us and all of you. But it does vary, I think, a little bit from nation to nation. But yeah, because the platforms are built on advertising models because they're they're created for advertisers, and now basically politicians are behaving as if they were, marketers, which they always have. But so, the Republicans were much faster in this election to I think, adopt those technologies, and the Democrats were, it becomes difficult to disentangle. And maybe we need, again, I think capital and capitalism is part of the problem. But I think it's very difficult to fight it because I don't think of it as a kind of disembodied, I mean, capital is often described as something sort of large and amorphous and as if it's this agent in itself. And I actually think it exists, it's a kind of assemblage that exists through all of these networks, technical networks and so forth, including economic ones. But as long as we exist in the kind of regime we're in, it will be difficult, the kind of political regime, by economic political regime, it will be difficult to resist, I think, yeah. But I don't think we should stop trying.
There's another question from Pierre.
Thank you. I enjoyed your talk very much. You mentioned a specific feature of drum, which was that it circulated from worker to worker. It was hand-given. So in a way, there's the same thing about Twitter. I can receive a tweet from an account I'm distantly connected, or I can have a retweet from one of my friends or one of my colleagues. And I was wondering what importance would you give to this retweet in the idea of counter-mediations? And I'm thinking about this, I'm thinking of Norbert Wiener's analysis at the end of Cybernetic and Society. And he says that in a society that communicates a lot, where message circulates, There are only certain types of message that can circulate a lot without being lost or transforming themselves in a kind of noise. And he calls them cliché. And like in the game in France, it's called the Arab telephone, where I say to someone something and the person repeats it, and at the end it comes back to me. And there are only certain types of message who can withstand all this kind of communication. So I was wondering whether if retweeting has an importance, or whether the algorithms are so strong that they completely annihilate the retweet, and whether, in a way, the retweeting, if it has an importance, would not privilege certain kind of messages, like dealing with fear, for example.
Yeah, thanks. That's great. Yeah, one of the things about Wiener is that, he operates on this model of communication and information that doesn't really have a place for affect. And I think that one of the things that we see is that affect and mood, in Flatley's term, plays a role in what kinds of messages get shared. And so I think that complicates that model. In terms of the question of retweets and algorithms, yeah, I think we all notice when someone who's a close friend retweets something, or more on Facebook shares something, and it pleases us more, and it sort of encourages us more. We also put more stock in some of the tweets of people we, I think, know, as opposed to people we don't know. So that kind of peer-to-peer connectivity, in a certain sense, and not just any peer, but some peers have more weight than others, does, I think, impact things. But the algorithms are pernicious. I mean, for example, the Twitter on my phone is horrible. I see so few tweets. It keeps wanting to show me, in case you missed it, and it keeps bringing back people who I have interacted with more frequently. Now, I've gone in and adjusted my settings a bit, but it doesn't seem to have helped a whole lot. So it's not that the algorithms are overwhelming and impossible to defeat, but I think that they complicate the issue. So, yeah, it's something that, and this is again where, what we really need are sort of woke tech people who will help create sort of oppositional and left kinds of software that will allow us to use Twitter and Facebook in a way that we could tailor or customize perhaps more to our likes and needs, and less to Facebook and its advertisers, or Twitter and its advertisers as well. I think that would help. For a while, there was a period when Facebook was really sort of, I don't even know beginning, but when it was clear that Facebook was the hegemonic social media network for academics, that a number of academics, Geert Lovink was involved in a couple of these projects, tried to create alternative versions of Facebook without ads and things like that. And they never got off the ground because they could never get the critical mass. You didn't have your friends and your community to share with there. And so there were some really, I think, well-meaning efforts that just never materialized. And so as long as we are kind of stuck with what we've got, I think counter-mediations that can be used within them, or to interface between us and Twitter, us and Facebook, technical ones might be the way to go. And also education. I think that it's just crucial that we all become educated about what's happening, to whatever extent we can, about how these social media are operating, to open those black boxes and look inside and see what those decisions are and so forth. And I don't think there's nearly enough of that kind of education happening. So.
There was another question from Jens.
Many thanks for your inspiring talk. from a disciplinary perspective, what would you say might be the specific task or the specific contribution of cultural and media studies in this context and in this dealings with the question of how to create counter moods in hypermediated environments? I know there's a lot of research done, social scientific, empirical research in political science and communication science, media psychology, and there are the tech people, the software designers, but what would our job in this, or might our job in this context be?
Yeah, thanks. I think it's one of the important things is probably for people in, let's say, the humanities and in the cultural fields, for us to stop just talking to each other. You know, the U.S. has seen a kind of significant movement towards what's called the public humanities, and that's been understood in a variety of different ways, some of which I find to be just kind of like go out in the community and help people, which is wonderful to do. I mean, I'm not opposed to that. But I think that it would be helpful for us to speak in such a way and to write in such a way that we can reach a wider audience through appearing, I mean, in more popular magazines, for example, on television and so on. I think we have things to say, and I think we often get caught up in, and I'm not opposed to the kind of specialized work that we do, and I do that kind of specialized theoretical work myself, but I think it's important for us also to be able to translate what we do into a language that can be understood more broadly. I think as teachers, we can do that work as well. It's slower that way, but I think it's helpful. And I think those are kind of our ways of doing it. Then I suppose you have artists and writers and so forth who maybe can do that through things like creating narrative stories, images that I'm not good at. I mean, you know, when I started writing this piece, you know, which Marie-Luise sort of made me do. And, you know, I'm not the best person at like saying this is what we need to do to solve the problem because it's a complicated problem. I'm much better, I think, at sort of thinking through what problems are and what the kind of assumptions that underlie the conditions are more than the solutions. Because the solutions all sound, oh yeah, we should talk to the public, of course. You know, I mean, they sound a little facile or something like that. But increasingly, and maybe it's just age, those kinds of things do seem increasingly valuable to us to get a kind of message out. I also think, though, we have to engage with the technology. I mean, I think that, you know, my own intellectual path took a detour. I started out as a student of 19th century American literature, got my PhD in 1983 at Berkeley and wrote a dissertation on the American transcendentalists. And through just the circumstances of where I could get a job, I ended up in a place that got me, Georgia Tech in Atlanta, that got me involved in science and technology studies. And I think that for a long time, I was really a very strong advocate of doing that, and now I just kind of assume that that's something we should do. But I do think that one of the things we need to do is not be afraid of, you know, looking into fields and topics or disciplines that may seem a little outside of our comfort zone, and understanding how these technologies work, not at the level of doing them or making things, but at the level of understanding what's entailed conceptually. And I think that if we understand that and work that into our teaching and into our writing, I think that can also help.
Wow.
Thank you very much as well. I wanted to ask, and I think some of the questions already went for that point, but you said, if I've written it down correctly, that in our media age, the difference to the age of Walter Lippmann is different only in degree. And in the end of your talk, you said, yeah, when you see these headlines of the New York Times, for example, then they have the same effect of causing factions in society. And I'm wondering if the difference is really only in degree, or if it is more a difference in like liability or visibility of responsibility, and if under these, if this is correct, if technology really can be the way to solve the problem, because technology is further obscuring the responsibility that, for example, Facebook as an editor, as someone who builds something like a like a newspaper page, but online and for different audiences, different pages. If this is obscuring responsibility, is the
So.
In a newspaper you have an editor, and you have an editorial line. And
Yeah, okay.
I have to interrupt a little bit with my. So we have to shorten the question.
Do you want to collect the questions?
So while in the newspaper you have an editorial line, and
Right,
you have someone you can point to who is responsible for what is the topic in.
Okay, so what you do have in Facebook, you also have people who are responsible for these things. First of all, for creating the algorithms and making the decisions about what kinds of information and stories do get shown and what don't, and who they're shown to, and so forth. So that there are people who are responsible, but in a different way. So I do believe it is a degree issue. I think the intensity, I think it's much more intense today than it was when you had just an editor in a print newspaper because of tailoring it to groups and individuals and so forth. But yeah, there are people who are responsible still.
Joscha, do you want to continue?
Yeah, just a
question,
very short question.
Come to an end.
I understood that, especially at the end of your talk, you try to show that it's easy to overestimate the influence of Facebook, for example, or certain aspects of Facebook. The same thing we found with Cambridge Analytics, who made something of an advertisement for the product, but it doesn't hold true. If you look what they really did, they overestimated themselves by purpose, and many people followed them. And so if it's possible to overestimate technology for the whole thing that happens, isn't it maybe necessary to look at other things to get the right proportions? For example, television. You haven't talked so much about television, but I think if you look at television in the USA, there's really a kind of distortion, reality distortion field. The whole practice of zapping, for example, becomes impossible because you cannot switch to certain channels without getting your mind set on a different part of the world and things like this. I think this is a much more obvious problem if you look at the proportions of how public opinion changed and how the discourse changed, and how, for example, television has nothing to do with news in the sense of journalism and journalist ethics in a big field of television news or television entertainment.
Yeah, I think television is crucial. I've written about it elsewhere. And I think right now what happens is that all of our media are working in conjunction with each other, so that television and newspapers cover the tweets of the president in the U.S., or they cover other forms of social media. They have their own websites, they have their own Twitter accounts, Facebook accounts, and so forth. So I think we're really in a time when all of these media work together, and I focused on Facebook and Twitter because they were in the news right now, but you're absolutely right, television is another powerful force in changing moods.
Thanks very much. I guess, we should now finish our first day, and I didn't get a chance, to ask you something. I only want to put the name, on the table, and we discussed this later on at the dinner. I don't know why I was always thinking of Paul Lazarsfeld listening to your talk, but we can talk about this later on. I would like to mention that we go, for those who want to go to have dinner together, we have booked a table at the Mövenpick, which is in this direction here on the campus, and we go together by bus. So we just, come together downstairs, and then we tell you the direction, or we go together to. Okay, next minutes.
Thank you all very much.